This is one of a series of live stream presentations that are aired monthly during the school year at noon. We will keep it under 60 minutes. We will try our best. And we will use a chat box so everyone should have access to it as a place where you can feel free to jot down any questions that you have throughout the presentation. And we will try our best to get to all of them. But if we don't, we will do our best to reach out to everyone with the answers. You should have also received a handout packet in an email form in English and in Spanish that has all the information that's going to be covered in today's session. You should also have additional information on how to reach us if you should be in need of additional support. Today's guest is Elise Vasquez. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
She is a specialist in bilingual language acquisition and students with disabilities. So welcome, Elise. We are both bilingual, and I can certainly remember the challenges that came with learning a new language. So I guess we can begin by defining bilingualism.
Perfect, and thank you everyone for joining us today. In a nutshell, bilingualism can be defined as your ability to speak and understand two languages. However, many people often get confused with the levels of bilingualism. A lot of people think it's an all or nothing. Either you're fluent in two languages or you're not. However, there are different degrees to bilingualism. And we now know, and experts agree, that within those degrees of bilingualism, for example, my son, Jeremy, who by the way, today's his birthday, he is considered bilingual because he understands Spanish. He may not respond in Spanish, but he understands conversations and he can respond in English to whatever I ask him in Spanish. So he is considered bilingual.
So could you walk us through some of those different types of bilingualisms?
Absolutely. So experts say that there are two forms of bilingualism. There is what we know as a balanced bilingual or simultaneous bilingual, or what we consider a sequential bilingual. A simultaneous bilingual, a lot of experts say it's a child that learns two languages at the same time, usually from birth to 3 years old. And there are and they are exposed to those two languages in a variety of contexts and exposures. And then we have sequential bilinguals, which they have a home language first, and then usually that second language they learn out of the home, usually at school or in a more academic environment or setting. And that usually happens after 3 years old. Now, I do want to say several things about the bilingual linguistic system. A lot of people often ask me, well, do bilinguals, the balanced bilinguals, do they reach the same developmental milestones that a monolingual child would, or a sequential bilingual, let's say a child that learns, their home language first? Yes, they do reach the same developmental milestones as other children. So if we look at what those developmental milestones are, usually around, a year old, they start developing words, and then we see that even within the development of words, they can use the language interchangeably. And I'm talking here about the balanced bilingual, interchangeably. And around 3 or 4 years old, we would start seeing more adult-like patterns and structures of speech. And a good example is, and I'm going to use a lot of personal anecdotals, is my nephew Czar. His mother spoke to him in Spanish. His father spoke to him in English at home. And he's 3 years old. And the last time I went to see him, he was like, Titi, Titi, come see mi tableta. Even though he interchanged the words, the thought was very clear, and he was able to give a complete thought, even though he had the two different words. So we see that there are wonderful cross-linguistic transfers between the two languages.
Okay, so so I guess I'm a sequential bilingual learner because I learned Spanish at home first, and then I learned English at school.
Mm-hmm.
So can you walk us through how your experience in being an English language learner?
Yes. So I am a true sequential bilingual. I came to the States from Puerto Rico at about 5 or 6 years old. Spanish is my home language, my first language. And I began to learn English here in the United States because, and I don't want to date myself, but because bilingual programs were just opening up in New York City during that time, and I would have had to travel really far. My parents made the decision, my mom made the decision that she was going to immerse me in an English-only classroom environment. Not understanding how important that home language is to access that academic language that a lot of researchers have been speaking about. And her goal was just to immerse me in English so that I could learn English and become academically, challenged. So I came here, and I don't remember my first 3 grades. I don't remember first grade, I don't remember second grade, I don't remember third grade. And interestingly enough, I was having this conversation with my mother yesterday about the difficulties and the challenges I had because I wasn't fluent enough, or I didn't have, the toolkit academically for English, yet the expectations were that I performed just as well as the children in my class that were English only speakers and that only knew one language. And I remember my mother said to me, well, the school was very concerned because I was years behind in reading and years behind in math, because basically what happened with me is that, so here I am, that trajectory, I'm learning language, I'm learning that home language, Spanish, and then it came to a stop. And then I had to start in English. So I'm 10 years old, but really my vocabulary, my English is of a 5 or 6 years old, a 6-year-old student. So it took me a very, very long time to develop English, to feel confident with English. And I think you and I discussed before that academically speaking, I struggled, and the challenges were very hard until about high school. And in high school, I was in honors classes, but it was a double challenge for me in terms of studying. And even with that, I failed the college entry exam. And, I remember having a discussion with the college advisor, and he was like, are you bilingual? And I said, no, right? I said, no, I'm not. English is my dominant language. That's my first language because it was my academic language. However, I realized that I am an English language learner, and I will always be an English language learner. And instruction for me looks different. And, it took me a very long time to feel comfortable with English. I don't know about you, but it took me a good 14 years to really gain that academic balance with English.
Yeah, and I think that we share a very similar experience in that I have very little recollection of first, second, and third grade, and I didn't really feel comfortable as an English speaker until maybe 4th or 5th grade.
Right.
And just as you, my entrance exams were not a walk in the park. It was a challenge. Yes. It was a struggle. So it was something that was just difficult to manage at the time. So what would you say are the learning levels children pass through as they gain a second language?
So let's begin that with New York State has identified 5 stages of proficiency in English, and there are many characteristics around these stages and these levels. But it's really important to know that language itself, we look at expressive language and receptive language, which basically is listening, speaking, reading, and writing. That's what we look at. Expressive language is how a person is able to, express their thoughts and how they are able to relay those messages. And we usually look at that through writing and through speaking. And then the receptive language is, how are the people receiving the information and what sense they're making out of it. And that usually happens with listening and reading. It's really important to note that before I begin describing the proficiency levels, that to acquire academic English may take 5 to 7 years on a good day. For me, I clearly stated that for me to feel comfortable, it took about 14 years, although academically I was doing okay, after middle school. So it does take 5 to 7 years, depending on exposure, depending on the foundation of the home language. That strong home language is really key to that academic success and to help transfer over into the new language or get the information in the new language. And it also depends on the context by which that new language is being used. So it all depends on that, a lot of variables. So we know that within these several language or levels of proficiency, we have the 5 stages, which is the entering stage. We're going to start with that first stage.
So before we get into the stages, just to clarify, if you have a strong foundation to your native language at home, that will determine the ease of transitioning from one proficiency level to another.
So the more exposure, the more development, the more academic foundation that a child has in their home language, the better it is for that child to access the new language. And not only to access the new language, but to be able to make those connections in the new language. So there are certain skills that in your new language help you access the second language. Think about the SATs. Think about the vocabulary section of the SATs. How many words are Latin-based words? Almost all of them, right? So a Spanish speaker can look at a word and break up that word into different parts because of that Spanish. So it makes it easier, that cross-linguistic transfer. So, I often tell parents, nurture the home language. Read to your children in the home language. Help them with writing in the home language. Because it's really important for them to have that in order to have that academic success and to gain that second language.
And there are 5 proficiency levels?
Yes.
Okay, so let's begin with the first one then, I guess.
Yes, so the first proficiency level is the entering student. Now, that's clearly stated. The entering student is the brand new student that comes in from, a different country that doesn't speak, the language or the new language. And this student has so many skills within their toolkit. They can draw, they can list, they can organize, they can point, they can, use gestures. We often think that children come here with a blank slate, but that is not true. They come with things. They can illustrate, and this child may verbalize maybe 1 or 2 words just to get their basic needs met. So, for example, I had a student that was new from the Dominican Republic, and even though I spoke the same language, he was, trying to practice English. And I had a routine in my class. Every morning I would extend my hand and say good morning. And for the first, 3 days, he wouldn't say anything. But by the 4th day, he was like, good morning. So he knew what that was, and that was his thing every day. He would say good morning, good afternoon. And this student can have difficulty conveying some messages and meaning of words in English. However, what's key to understand here is that often it is, I'm just going to plug it in there, it is the responsibility of teachers to get them to access that curriculum. And so it's really important that we provide them with strategies to help them do that. The second level of proficiency is the emerging student. And here the student begins to speak in short phrases and simple sentences. This is where you actually see the student, begin to use the language. They may pronounce it wrong, grammatically it's wrong, but just to hear them engage, it's really an eye-opening process to see them use 2 or 3 words to say, me go water, to say, I need to go get water. And here the student also is able to do a lot of things, they're able to tell, they're able to restate, they're able to compare, they're able to question. And they're able to predict, especially, I know in my class I use a lot of like sentence frames, and I would say, I predict that, and they would be able to fill in like some of the blanks. They're able to graph and illustrate, and do diagrams. And again, the importance of that home language is really key to how that child is going to gain access or acquire the new language. So we see that that's like the common theme, the importance of the home language and development of the home language. The third stage of development is the transitioning stage. And that stage is often it can be very confusing for the professional and even for parents. So we have a low transitioning student and we have a high transitioning student. And, this is a child that can speak socially pretty well, but when it comes, and may read pretty well, but when it comes to really comprehending stories, especially fiction stories, may have difficulty because they are still developing language, the second language. But here, this student or this child can visualize, they can evaluate, they can predict, they can express, right? They can say, no, I don't like that, and they can give you the reason for that. They can demonstrate with appropriate scaffolds, well, the supports in place academically, and they're able to access grade level content, but with those multiple supports. And I think I should talk about what those supports look like so that parents are fully aware of what that is. But one thing that I always tell parents is that children have to develop that oral language first so that they can then make that transfer to writing and reading. And that's what our ELLs should be doing. They should practice the language a lot. And so for this child and for all of our ELLs, and I would say for all of our children in New York City, I would say that development of the oral language is key for them to access other areas of the curriculum. The expanding student, they have the advanced skills in cognitive language. Right here is where you start seeing the second language working. They are beginning to think in English. They can analyze, they can evaluate. They are making out of the text connections. I had a student that I remember her thing was Egyptian, Egyptian history, and she would come to me. She would say, "Ms. Vasquez, I just read about such and such a thing," and then she would automatically apply it to something else that she, read about or learned about or saw on the Discovery Channel. So they're making those contexts. The student here too is getting those idioms, those idiomatic expressions like "it's raining cats and dogs" or "I'm in a pickle," and they're using it as well. And you see that the student is really progressing in English. They are speaking English most of the time, and they are using grade level content, but they also still require support to access some of the material. And in terms of the linguistic demand, here we start seeing that the child is making less grammatic errors in terms of speaking and writing. And then the last stage.
I'm sorry, and this is in the second language.
Correct, in the second language.
Okay.
And the last stage of proficiency is what we call commanding, or the advanced, linguistic student. And here, the student can meet grade level standards with supports, and they are using more grammatical structures. They use the academic vocabulary. They begin to use the academic vocabulary, and additionally, they can decontextualize situations. So they can look at a situation and say, "Okay, wait a minute. Let's look at everything surrounding this one situation, and let's try to make sense of it." Good to know that, again, although this process may take 5 to 7 years, it may take longer. Depending again on, what was I going to say, home language, the foundation of the home language, exposure to home language and the new language, and in which context and variables that the student is using it in.
So it's interesting because you mentioned these, and I'm understanding these 5 proficiency levels as different layers of competencies.
Mm-hmm.
But when we began defining bilingualism, we said that you can have someone who can be fluent, be considered fluent and bilingual, even though they just understand but not speak?
So this is where it kind of gets a little iffy. So within the 5 proficiency levels, a child can be different proficiency levels for different modalities. So I'll give you an example. In listening and speaking, that child could be expanding, right? They have more advanced skills to understand conversation, right? But in reading and writing, they could still be transitioning. So remember that I said that we have to look at bilingualism in terms of, I would say, degrees of understanding, right? I consider myself fluent in Spanish. However, my Spanish is not as academic as I would want it to be. But I can read it, I can write it, and I have a lot of social, I can do the social language. And depending on who I'm talking to, I can change my accent too. So, in Spanish, but that's but a good example, my son, who he can understand Spanish, right? I had a lot of students that were emerging students, and they were acquiring, English, and they had a degree of bilingualism because they could understand it, but they may not have been able to tell me what they understood in the new language, but they could tell me in Spanish. I had a student, I always remember I had a student, and we had to do a diagnostic reading assessment. And I said, okay, so tell me what happened in the story. She just gave me a look. She said, I need to tell you in Spanish. And I said, tell me in Spanish. And she understood every single thing that happens in the story, and she made those connections. So some sounds or grammar, just a lot of things. It could be that they're not comfortable yet. For older students, it could be because, they have an accent and they don't want to speak. So there are a lot of variables in terms of when they really take the plunge to speak English.
Okay, and I guess I'm just questioning how these, I would imagine that you would need to be an educator or a professional who's really truly understands the nuances in language acquisition.
So it's really important that, and I'm just gonna plug in parents. It's really important that when parents of English language learners have concerns about the degree of how their child is learning, or that they have concerns because maybe there is an academic challenge, that they have these discussions with these what we consider pedagogues or teachers that are fully versed in what language acquisition looks like, because there are many different layers in terms of how a child acquires language. And the thing is too, that even though we know that it's a developmental process and it's the same for all cultures, ethnicities, and gender, there are different individual nuances within there. Each child develops individually how they access that second language. So it's not just, okay, well, this child should be here. This takes 1 to 3 years, so now the child should be here. No, because there are other variables to consider. There are other things to consider in terms of acquiring that second language.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, so can you share with us some signs that may point to language acquisition issues?
Absolutely. So it is very common that within the proficiency levels, that we see things that are what we say, part of that developmental process. What you just heard me do right now, those utterances, is very, very normal, and it's part of that process. And then there are times where we go back and forth between the new language and our home language. So I know for Spanish, I often go back with Spanish and English. If you catch me in the Cross Bronx on a bad day, my Spanish is going to come out, depending on where I feel more comfortable. And that code switching is very, very normal. Then there are words that I automatically use with my English sentences. So a good example, and I often say this all the time, if you come to my house, I'm going to invite you to my sala. I'm not going to invite you to my living room. I tell my daughter, get me the chanclas. I don't say get me the slippers. So there are just words that are just programmed for me to use. Then there are some things in terms of what I call language loss. That's really important. And I do want to talk about language loss a little bit. I'm not going to get too deep into it just because it's such a huge topic. But there are certain characteristics of language loss that for many people who don't understand language acquisition, they may think it's a disability. So think about the process that you went through to learn English and, you know, having Spanish. I know that right away I lost my Spanish, right away, because, you know, Spanish was stopped in my home. My mom said no more Spanish. We're going to be English only. And so that was my challenge. And so as I stopped using my Spanish, it kind of, not that I lost it, but it just stayed stagnant. It didn't grow. The Spanish didn't grow because now it was all English. And then for me to retrieve information, I had a very difficult time retrieving information. So if a child, let's say, is just learning English for the first time, and a lot of our children, let's say that they go home over the summer. So they go home in June, and then they come back in September, and then they go to class, and then, you know, the mom is like, well, what's going on? You know, like, why is my child struggling? Well, it could be because the child basically didn't practice English while they were away. And so because they didn't practice while they were away, you know, there's a term, if you don't use it, you lose it. And so, you know, not that the child has fully lost it, but that, you know, there are certain parts of the language that, especially if the child is just learning it, they seem to lose certain parts of it faster than acquisition. They can have a decreased, remember I talked about that expressive language in terms of speaking and in terms of writing. So there could be a decrease in that expressive language. So you can see a child really struggling with, you know, reading comprehension. You can see a student or a child struggling with the writing. You can see errors grammatically, you know, and you know, you struggle, or you can see that the child is trying to make connections, and you're like, well, I know something is going on because I see it, but it's because maybe the child is just trying to find the right word, or maybe they lost what the word is. You know, that happens to me all the time. I don't know if that happens to you, but I lose my words, you know, all the time. Just this morning, I was asking my daughter to get me something. I said, the round pointed thing, and I often struggle with this word, and it was the funnel. It was a funnel. You know, it wasn't anything huge. It was just the funnel. And I kept describing it to her, and she was just like, what are you talking about? So there are those things of language loss. And then remember that there are things that we learn from our home language that transfer to the new language. And I'm just going to use Spanish here as an example. You know, the double L in Spanish. What sound does the double L make?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So if you say, for me, it's a little bit more powerful. It's like a J, right? So if I say calle, right? So if I see the double L when I'm learning a language, let's say for the word yellow, I'm going to say yeyo, right? Because of the double L. I'm going to transfer that over. And so it's not that I don't know that the double L is the O sound. It's that in my native language, that double L makes the J sound. The J makes what sound in Spanish?
Hey.
Hey, which is the H sound. So I might see a word, you know, and I'm just trying to think, Jesse, and I'm going to go Hesse, right? Just because that's what I'm transferring over. And then there are some cultures that don't have vowels. So if I ask, you know, if as a teacher, if I ask a student, write the word 10, and they write TN, and I'm not sure, you know, I didn't know that culture doesn't have vowels, I might look as a disability. So it's really important that, you know, these conversations with parents and professionals happen in terms of culture and in terms of, you know, how language works in those specific cultures.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So so I know you keep mentioning how important it is to have a foundation of your native language and to truly understand that in order to facilitate language acquisition a new language. So can you just talk to us a little bit more about how to maintain the native language while the new language is being learned?
Oh, absolutely. This is my favorite part.
Right.
I often tell parents that the one key success where all research agrees and where all experts agree is how important development is of that native language. Now, New York City is great in the sense that we have programs to maintain the home languages. We have dual language programs, we have bilingual, programs. However, with over 160 languages in our school system, we just don't have all of that, right? So at home, it's really important that the parent, takes time to read with their children, that the parent takes time to have these conversations in Spanish, that the parent really pushes for the child to use the language and to experience that language in different contexts. And I think, I know that I used to make a concerted effort with my son, and I would take him to museums and I would take him to parks, and we would speak about several things in the native language. And more than that, I know that I would often hear, well, a lot of parents would often say, well, in my country, I may have only went to school up to, 5th or 6th grade, right? And then I tell them, do you like telenovelas? They're like, yeah. I'm like, oh my God, watch telenovelas. Ask, what is the main character doing? What do you think is going to happen next? And just keep that language going. Just keep it going. And, it's really important that that foundation is set and that it's clear.
Sure.
Also, I think that for the majority of bilingual children, it is really important that the parent chooses the academic program wisely for their child. And so, because I'm an advocate for bilingual education, I'm always going to push for bilingual education. And I think that it starts there. Like, where can I really get that support in the home language? And if the school offers a bilingual education program, that's something for the parents to consider. Second of all, and I know that I kind of referenced it earlier, there are so many free opportunities for parents to, engage in like these great academic discussions with their children. And a good place to start is at the school to see what events that they can provide for the parents and resources that they can give the parents.
Okay, and that's something that the parent coordinator can.
Absolutely. There are, I know as a parent myself, I usually, if I have internet access, I go to free events in New York City and everything comes up, what's free. At the parent coordinator too, there are programs in schools where they give free museum passes to over like 30 to 40 museums in the city. So that's something that, the parents should really advocate for if they have that. The key here is that we are a community and that we all want, really great outcomes for our children. And so we know that we have to have these collaborative relationships with parents in order to do that. And so by all means, the parent coordinator is such a great resource in the school. Teachers are great resources in the school. And even the field support centers, they host events for parents. INCLUDEnyc is another great place where parents can get information in terms of, really getting support and how to get access to free things around the city. And New York City is great for that. New York City is very great for that.
That's great. So, interestingly enough, I watched a lot of telenovelas and I watched a lot of Sábado Gigante growing up.
So did I.
So I shared in the very early on that everyone has documents that were shared with you electronically. In those documents, you have a PowerPoint, and feel free to familiarize yourselves with the PowerPoint slide number 22 and 23.
Mm-hmm.
They're one and the same, and the first one is really aimed at kind of assessing where you are in terms of understanding of the chart and of information. whereas the second one kind of serves more as an answer key. But I'm going to allow Dalis to share with us a little more in detail as to what those slides speak to.
Great. So slide 23 in particular is a slide that was presented by the New York City Division of English Language Learners. It's one of my favorite slides to use because what happens is that there are a lot of shared traits, and with children that are English language learners and students with disabilities. However, with English language learners, and I think on the second slide I highlighted the differences. So a good example, if a child doesn't know the sounds, right, the sounds of a letter, that can be an indication of a student with a disability. Well, they're having, a hard time. However, for an L, they may not know the sounds of those letters because the sounds are not in their first language, right? And we kind of set that with a double L. Then if, let's say, for a student with disability, you have the child, the student or the child doesn't know like the letter sound correspondence, right? So if you have a W, right, that sound, and the student doesn't know that. However, here it is with the English language learners, they may not know that sounds either because the letter and the sound are different. So I know in some languages, a T is pronounced as a W, right? So what does that look like? And then there are other languages that the letters just don't exist. Some Asian languages, the letter R does not exist. Yet we want the children to say the letter R, but like but the student never had that sound. So it kind of struggles. Another good thing about that chart is there's another part where it says following directions. So both groups may have difficulty following directions. However, for the English language learner, if they don't understand the directions in English, they don't understand the directions in English. They just don't understand it because it's not their home language. So, those are some examples of those similarities. Another really great one is, I think toward the end of the chart is that the child may seem frustrated. Well, think about when you're learning something new. It's frustrating. And I think that we often forget that learning a new language is cognitively exhausting. Think about when you're learning something new, and like right now my daughter's in 6th grade, and 6th grade math is cognitively exhausting for me. I just can't get through it now, and what that looks like. So our children, that is a trait that they share, but it's because of the circumstance, right? And so I love that chart because it distinguishes why it's different for the English language learner.
Okay, great. And what are some of the signs? What are some signs of a learning disability?
So I want to preface this by saying that there is no standardized measure. There is no standardized measure. There is no test that will tell you if an English language learner is struggling, if it's because of a language difference or if it's because of a disability. So I want to make that clear. It is a concerted effort with all people involved with the child, and it's really about knowing the child. So I just want to preface that. However, the one thing I always tell parents, and I'm a parent myself, is that you have to look at those developmental milestones, right? So that's a very good place to start. Is my child developmentally appropriate where they need to be in terms of language and in terms of, other milestones? And so if your child has reached those developmental milestones and there was never an issue developmentally, then the questions that you have to ask yourself is, okay, they reached the developmental milestones, is this more of an acquisition issue? Now, if they haven't reached the developmental milestones and, the child has struggled, for a very long time academically, then, I would say that these are the discussions that you should have with, the teachers that are providing supports for your children. So one thing to look at is, is my child progressing in both languages the way that they should, right? Sometimes children with a disability, they don't progress in both languages, right? Even with support, right? They kind of like stay stuck, even with support. And, they, developmentally, they are not where they're supposed to be. So if in my home language, I'm 10 years old, but developmentally I'm at 5 years old, then that's something that's a trigger for me to say, oh, it may be much more than just an academic challenge. Second, if I see that, my child, along with the peers of the same cultural background, I see that the social exchange is not appropriate, right? That may be a trigger, in terms of that it may be a manifestation of a disability, right? That it may be a disability. But one thing that I often caution parents with is that with an English language learner, the frustration is the new language, right? And with the student with disability, the frustration may be all academic areas. There may be developmental challenges. A student may have an auditory processing disorder where they're just not processing the information the way it should, and this happens within the home language as well. So, if the child is struggling with the home language, and we see that the child didn't meet developmental milestones, and that's usually a trigger that the child may have a disability, usually. But again, it's very individual, and we will have to take a look at the entire picture, and it's something that it has to be a team effort and approach in looking at how the child has been performing.
Okay.
Right.
So, so one of the things we like to stress is that if you have suspicions that there might be a learning disability or learning issue, again, as we mentioned early on, you have information electronically that was shared with everyone. So you should also within that packet you should have a letter of referral in Spanish and in English, and a frequently asked questions sheet that also mentions how to go about reaching us in English and in Spanish. We have a helpline that's been designated to support families who may be experiencing these issues or concerns.
May I add something
yes,
to that too?
Absolutely.
I think that for any parent that has concerns about, their children, your greatest resource is the school environment. And really having those conversations with teachers and everyone involved in the academic progress of your child. So it really should be a concerted effort in making those decisions in terms of if there is a disability and if parents are really worried about that.
Agreed. I think it's very important to continue to build on those relationships. And if you have concerns, work with the school personnel to kind of develop a plan to see how we can address whatever concerns you may be having about your child. So at this time, before we end, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions that anyone may have. And please feel free to write them in the chat box. Again, that's what it's there for. So.
But while we are waiting for some questions, we do have
one. Okay, so can you give advice to parents in New York City who are interested in putting their child in an ELL program, an English language learner program, and how to choose between transitional, bilingual, English as a new language, and dual language?
Okay.
Loaded one.
That is a loaded one. That's going to take me about 25 minutes to talk about. No. So first, let's talk about the differences within the programs. So dual language is a 50-50 model. It's half English and half the native language or home language. Transitional bilingual usually starts more with the home language and then gradually decreases the home language over time. And then English as a new language is no home language support, but a lot of English language support. So, because I am an advocate for bilingual education, and I I keep stressing the importance of the home language. I would say that you have to look at, one, what the program in your school or what the school offers. Now, if let's say you really want a transitional bilingual education program, which many parents do, but your school does not offer that, then what I would do is, if I really, really wanted my child in a transitional bilingual program, is that then I would speak to the principal of the school, and I think that the next steps would be to go to the district office, and then the district is responsible for finding them an appropriate program. Now, I know a lot of schools that offer ENL as a standalone program. What I want to say with that is that all research shows that a dual language program gives you the highest outcomes, and late exit bilingual programs give you the highest academic outcomes for our English language learners. But we don't have that for every single language. So with the ENL program, what you have to look at is really, is it an established ENL program? How are the children being supported? And again, then I would say to the parent, well, then at home, please, support that, home language. And I hope I answered the question.
Okay, great. Well, Denise, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us and everyone else. Before we end, I'd like to just point out that we do have another upcoming live stream event. It is going to be focused on puberty, sexuality, and behavior. And it's going to be on Thursday, May 17th from 12 to 1. So please, if you can join us, that would be great. And also to remind everyone to please check our website for any information about upcoming events. And a reminder that past live stream presentations and topics are also available to access on our website.